to give you an idea of what we're talking, this ream of paper represents the 11,363 people that live in the city of Oneida. This sheet of paper represents the individuals that would be affected based under the changes of this local law, when you look at numbers versus numbers. For me, I think, my feeling is that we have the duty to look out for the safety of this pile more so than the safety of this pile. For whatever reason they chose to take this path, that's their doing. That's nothing to do with us. I would rather err on the side where I can say why I did something than to look at somebody in the face and have to explain why I did not. And the last thing that I want to do is to look at a mom or a dad or anybody and say, you know, had we done that, maybe this situation wouldn't be the way it is right now. Are we going to probably end up in court over it if we go through and approve it? I would say there's a pretty good chance of it. But again, I would rather argue why I did it than why I did not. And go from there.
First of all, my name is Shannon Rowan. I live in Oneida. I'm a domestic violence survivor. I first started being assaulted at age 19. I'm now engaged to somebody who's on the sex offender registry who committed a crime when he was 12 years old. He was charged as an adult. He's a level 2, and he's been paying for it, as have I, for over half of his life. And I would first like to debunk the sex offender equals pedophile myth. That's blatantly untrue. There are over 200 offenses in New York State that can get somebody on the registry. Many of them have nothing to do with children. Many of them are no-contact crimes. Moving on. As I forget your name, I'm so sorry, mentioned, there are quite a bit of lawsuits and precedents for residency restrictions. Right here is just a small list of all of the residency restrictions that have been struck down as unconstitutional because they preempt state law in the past 5 years. These are all counties in New York. Now, there's also been some study on residency restrictions in particular, which I asked the council, they reviewed it, they indicated that they had, but they didn't believe it. Regardless, I've provided a couple of quotes here from people who are PhDs, who are objective, who have gone to school for many years to research sex crimes and the people who commit them. And here are a few of the quotes from the most recent studies. Residence restrictions may instead increase recidivistic sex crimes. The bottom line is that adult sex offenders do not molest children because they live near schools. Residence restrictions, at best, promote a false sense of security for concerned citizens. Consequences may inadvertently contribute to dynamic risk factors that ultimately increase danger, can lead to homelessness and transience, which interfere with effective tracking, monitoring, and close probationary. I noticed in the proposed law text claims that it's 25 to 35%, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. This is patently false. All the research, even dating back to before the registry, is actually in the single digits. The general rearrest rates tend to be higher, but that is because sex offenders typically have much harsher regulations imposed on them, such as owning a computer or having internet access. So I'll just read you the first two because they're the most recent. Connecticut, 2.7%. New York, 3.5%. Just for a little comparison, this is comparing the recidivism rates from the Connecticut study of sex offenders, drug offenders, DUI offenders, burglary, robbery, and violating restraining order. This is sex offenders. This is drug offenders. That's DUI, and the rest is self-explanatory. We are regulating the group of people who may commit, in the minds of some, the most heinous crimes, but we are not targeting the correct people. As, again, he mentioned, 95% of children are abused by a family member or a friend behind closed doors. They're not abducted from a school. They're not taken from a park. We hear about the high-profile cases because that's what's interesting, and that's what gets our attention. But that is not the reality, and we are failing the children who are truly suffering by basing our public policy on myths.
I commend the council on what you're trying to do. I believe, as you folks do, we have many social ills that we need to take care of, and this is one of them. I need to ask a question, Mr. Mayor. Has anybody spoken to the probation department about your new local law? Have you?
We've spoken to the police department. I personally spoke to Troy Tiller, who's the head of the sex offender, taking control of them here in the city. And he's in close contact with the county and has been talking to him about this law. I personally haven't. I don't know if anybody else has, but I spoke with the police chief, the public safety commissioner, and Mr. Tiller for about over an hour, discussing all different angles and their concerns, my concerns.
Okay, I would just ask, if you're going to go through with this, that maybe you put it off for one more meeting and we can get together with the county and talk to the probation department about it or anybody else and see how this affects us, as well as everybody else.
Finally, restricting where sex offenders who have satisfied their conditions of their sentences and have satisfied the post-sentence conditions put on them by the courts, saying they can't live here or there doesn't keep them from walking by a school or walking by some workplace where some potential victim might be. It does not solve the problem. If we're going to try to run sex offenders out of town, which is what this really is, in my opinion, that's how I characterize it, why not about all the other people who have offended and who actually put people at real risk? If we're going to say sex offenders can't live within 1,000 feet of a school because an individual sex offender might reoffend, what about the guy or woman who drove drunk? Drunk drivers kill about 12,000 people a year in this country. I want to protect our children from drunk drivers as well as sex offenders. So are you going to apply the logic, if there is any logic? Are you going to apply the science, if there is any science to this? And I don't think there is any science. Where do you stop? Are you going to bring in other offenders who are actually more likely to kill a kid than these sex offenders? I think it's a feel-good proposal. I haven't heard anybody define and document the problem and establish a connection, certainly that would satisfy the Court of Appeals, that this problem is solved by this solution and it's going to make things better. And yes, I'm very sensitive to the argument that we're allowing the rights of a minority to dictate what the majority wants. The reality is that the Constitution protects all of us. And when you allow its protections to be chipped away for some group that you don't like, the history of humankind has shown that those protections get chipped and chipped and chipped, and finally there are no protections for the rest of us.
I've raised two children in the city, and they both spent their elementary schools years at the Seneca Street School. Both were kept safe during their elementary school years and then later in high school by the actions of the Oneida PD, and also by a prevailing attitude of the community which insisted that its most vulnerable citizens be protected. Children depend on us to protect them from dangers they cannot foresee. Jim Chamberlain has proposed reasonable legislation on who may live in close proximity to areas where children live, congregate, and recreate. It doesn't affect anyone who is presently living in any area of this city, but only those who move here after the legislation becomes effective. Laws must strike a balance, as Mr. Hedgeline has indicated, but only the laws must strike a balance between the rights of some and the interests of the majority. The restriction which is proposed restricts level 2 and 3 sex offenders from living too closely to locations where children gather. While there is some disagreement, a lot of knowledgeable people here and a lot of good opinions about what is the right thing to do, I grant all of you people the respect that you're due for coming here and expressing your interest. While there is some disagreement about the relative chance that a convicted individual will direct criminal behavior against a child, there is no disagreement from the overwhelming majority that this legislation is an intelligent form of risk reduction. It does not pretend to solve this problem. It, however, may reduce the risk. If Councilman Chamberlain's proposal prevents one act against a child, then it will have been of value. That which does not occur cannot be measured. That's one of the problems we're dealing with right here tonight. While some express anger at this proposal, those with an interest in it and an affection for this community will only be puzzled if the council does not support it.
And as somebody else pointed out, the majority of the people, actually all of the people that are on the registry as of whatever date that this takes effect will not be affected by this law. Just people that are looking to come in to the city of Oneida. And I also agree with the mayor's comments. I would rather do this to protect our children than have to explain to one citizen in the city of Oneida the reason why we didn't.
We all would need to be more comfortable with whatever decision we come to. We want to make sure we get it right. Correct. And I can amend my motion if that's, table it until our August 21st meeting.
Any more discussion from the council? Anything from the public? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Table to August 21st.